Hi friends, welcome back to the channel. Today we are going to discuss a very common symptom by which patients present, that is dysphagia. Now before starting the lecture, I would suggest that you can have a printout of the lecture beforehand and start making notes while watching the video lecture. Also you can join the Telegram channel for all the instant updates and discussions. You can also check out the Harrison based test series course which is available on the MediLectures app. So firstly we will discuss the intro, that what is dysphagia and some related terms, what is the physiology of swelling, then the pathophysiology of dysphagia including oropharyngeal as well as esophageal dysphagia, and then how to approach a patient with the help of history, physical examination and certain diagnostic procedures. So let's begin the lecture. Dysphagia is defined as the difficulty in swallowing. Now it refers to the problems in transit of food or liquid from mouth to hypopharynx or through the esophagus. Now severe dysphagia can compromise nutrition, cause aspiration and reduce the quality of life of a person. Now when we consider some related terms, aphasia means inability to swallow. This occurs in complete esophageal obstruction, which is most commonly seen with impaction of food bolus or the foreign body. Odynophagia means painful swallowing and it typically results from mucosal ulceration of oropharynx or esophagus. Globus pharyngeus is defined as a foreign body sensation which typically is present in the neck and do not interfere with the swallowing. Transfer dysphagia frequently results in nasal regurgitation and pulmonary aspiration, and it is a characteristic feature of oropharyngeal dysphagia. Now phagophobia simply means fear of swallowing and there can be refusal to swallow. These both terms can be seen either with some psychogenic conditions or there can be anticipatory anxiety. Patient is anxious, he has fear of swallowing and refuse to swallow because of its anticipatory anxiety about food bolus obstruction, odynophagia or the aspiration it will cause. Now let's briefly discuss the physiology of swallowing for a better understanding of dysphagia. So firstly, the swallowing begins with oral phase, which is a voluntary phase. In this, there is preparation during which food is masticated and mixed with saliva. Now this is followed by a transfer phase. Now defect in this phase can lead to transfer dysphagia, which we discussed in the previous slide. Now in the transfer phase, bolus is pushed into the pharynx by the tongue, that is transfer of food bolus occurs from the mouth to the pharynx. Now bolus entry into the hypopharynx initiates the pharyngeal swallow response. Now it is a centrally mediated response. It is a centrally mediated response which involves complex series of actions which leads to propulsion of food bolus from the pharynx to esophagus while preventing its entry into the airway. Now in this, larynx is elevated and pulled forward, upper esophageal sphincter opens and the tongue propels the food into the esophagus. Now this is followed by lower esophageal sphincter relaxation. Now LES relaxes as food enters the esophagus and remains relaxed until the peristalsis has delivered the food bolus into the stomach. After this, the primary peristalsis begins in whole of the esophagus and these involve sequenced inhibition followed by contraction of musculature along the entire length of the esophagus. This is involving the inhibition followed by contraction of the musculature of esophagus, which forms a wave of peristalsis so that food bolus can propel forwards. Now this sequenced inhibition is known as deglutitive inhibition, which precedes before the peristaltic contraction. So first, after the entry of food into the oral cavity, there is a voluntary oral phase followed by a transfer phase which transfer the food bolus after mastication into the pharynx. Then there is a initiation of pharyngeal swallow response, which is centrally mediated, involves elevation and pulling up of the larynx, opening of upper esophageal sphincter, and then tongue will propel the food into the esophagus. Soon after the entry of food in the upper part of the esophagus, LES will relax. There will be relaxation of lower esophageal sphincter, followed by beginning of primary peristalsis, which has inhibition followed by contraction, and these inhibition are termed as deglutitive inhibition, so that food can propel along the esophagus due to the peristaltic waves which are formed. Now it is important to understand certain features like the muscles of oral cavity, pharynx, upper esophageal sphincter, as well as cervical esophagus, that is the part above this line. These are striated muscles which are supplied by the lower motor neurons of the cranial nerves. So for example, the muscles of the oral cavity will be supplied by 5th and 7th nerve. The tongue is supplied by the 12th nerve, and the muscles of pharynx will be supplied by the 9th and 10th nerve, along with the cervical esophagus, which will also be supplied by the 10th nerve. Now when we consider the upper esophageal sphincter, this is usually closed at rest. So it is closed at rest because of its inherent elastic nature as well as neurogenic contraction of the cricopharyngeus muscle. Now when the food bolus is entering the pharynx, there will be associated opening of this upper esophageal sphincter. Now this happens because of the cessation of the vagal excitation for this cricopharyngeal contraction, as well as simultaneous contraction of the suprahyoid as well as geniohyoid muscle that will pull open the upper esophageal sphincter. So for the opening to happen, we have to inhibit the cricopharyngeus muscle and will need the help of suprahyoid as well as geniohyoid muscle. Now in the esophagus, the neuromuscular apparatus for peristalsis is distinct in proximal and distal part of esophagus. So in the proximal, that is cervical part of the esophagus, we discussed that like the pharynx, it has striated muscles, and these are supplied by the 10th nerve, that is vagus nerve. On the other hand, the distal esophagus as well as lower esophageal sphincter, these are composed of smooth muscles, and these are controlled by excitatory and inhibitory neurons in the myenteric plexus. So these are controlled by the esophageal myenteric plexus, which is present in the muscular layer of the esophagus. Now there are certain neurotransmitters which can be excitatory and certain which can be inhibitory. So the excitatory neurotransmitters include acetylcholine and substance P. On the other hand, inhibitory include VIP and nitric oxide. So these are the basics which we have discussed, which will be required for the understanding of the dysphagia. So finally we discussed that peristalsis occurs due to activation of inhibitory followed by excitatory neurons in the myenteric plexus. So in other words, first the esophagus dilates followed by contracts for the effective propulsion of the food. This will help in propelling the food forwards. Now coming on to the pathophysiology of dysphagia. Firstly, we'll see the classification of dysphagia, which can be according to the location. This has two types. First is oropharyngeal dysphagia, or there can be esophageal dysphagia. Now, the second classification is according to the mechanism. There can be structural dysphagia or motor, also known as propulsive dysphagia. Now, it is important to note that more than one mechanism can be present in a patient with dysphagia. For example, a patient who is undergoing radiation therapy for head and neck cancer. Now, the tumor itself can lead to functional difficulty in swallowing, and there can be radiation induced cervical esophageal stenosis leading to structural dysphagia. So, there can be both mechanisms in a single patient of dysphagia. Now, we will be discussing the oropharyngeal followed by esophageal dysphagia, certain salient features of both types. Firstly, the oral phase dysphagia is characterized by poor bolus formation and control. Because of this, food has prolonged retention in the oral cavity. There may be associated drooling and seeping out of the food. There is difficulty in initiating swallowing. There can be premature spillage of food in hypopharynx, which can result in aspiration into trachea and regurgitation into the nasal cavity. So, these are the features of oral phase dysphagia. Now, certain features of pharyngeal phase dysphagia are retention of food in the pharynx due to poor tongue or pharyngeal propulsion or obstruction at the level of upper esophageal sphincter. Now, the patient can have associated hoarseness of voice and cranial dysfunction. Now, discussing the esophageal dysphagia. Firstly, the adult esophagus length is around 18 to 26 centimeter. It is divided into cervical esophagus. The cervical esophagus is from the pharyngoesophageal junction, which is from the upper esophageal sphincter till the suprasternal notch. So, this is the cervical esophagus, and then from the suprasternal notch till the diaphragmatic hiatus, there is thoracic esophagus. When we consider the internal diameter with distension, it is 2 centimeter in the anteroposterior plane and 3 centimeter in the lateral plane. So, can you guess below what diameter, below what dimension a patient will feel dysphagia? So, solid food dysphagia occurs when the internal dimension becomes less than 1.3 centimeter or 13 mm. When the dimension is below 13 mm, there will be solid food dysphagia without any liquid dysphagia. Now, it is important to note that circumferential lesions are more likely to cause dysphagia than the partial lesions of the esophageal wall. Now, coming on to a very important flowchart, that is approach to the patient of dysphagia. So, in this flowchart, we have classified dysphagia into oropharyngeal and esophageal. Individual category is then classified into structural and propulsive causes. So, firstly, the dysphagia which is located to the neck has associated nasal regurgitation, aspiration, associated ENT symptoms. This is usually a oropharyngeal dysphagia. On the other hand, if the dysphagia is localized only to the chest, or there can be sometimes radiation to the neck associated with food impaction, it is usually a esophageal dysphagia. So, firstly, we will discuss oropharyngeal, then we will discuss the esophageal dysphagia. Now, in oropharyngeal dysphagia, important structural causes include Zenker's diverticulum, oropharyngeal neoplasm, cervical web, any congenital abnormalities, corrosive injury, radiation, etc. Now, when we consider the Zenker's diverticulum, it is usually seen in elderly population. The patient presents with dysphagia along with regurgitation, aspiration of food, and halitosis. Now, the pathogenesis behind it is there is stenosis of the cricopharyngeus muscle which form the upper esophageal sphincter. Now, when there is increased pharyngeal pressure during swallowing, there is development of pulsion diverticula immediately above the cricopharyngeus in the region of potential weakness. Now, this weakness is in the triangular area which is known as Killian's dehiscence. So, a formation of pulsion diverticulum occurs which is known as Zenker's diverticulum. Now, cricopharyngeal bars can also lead to limited distension of cricopharyngeal, leading to development of this Zenker's diverticulum. Now, coming on to the propulsive causes of oropharyngeal dysphagia, these can be either neurogenic or myogenic. So, cerebral vascular accidents can lead to upper motor neuron type of palsy. Parkinson's lead to rigidity, which can lead to neurogenic propulsive oropharyngeal dysphagia. Amyotropic lateral sclerosis along with GBS, these leads to lower motor neuron type of paralysis, and there can be UMN type of palsy associated with cerebral palsy. Now, the myogenic causes are rare, and these can be myasthenia gravis, polymyositis, oculopharyngeal muscular dystrophy, myotonic dystrophy, etc. Now, coming on to the esophageal dysphagia, we can classify it as propulsive or structural based on the history itself. So, on history, if the patient is having solid dysphagia, it is more likely a structural dysphagia, and if the patient is having solid as well as liquid dysphagia, it is more likely propulsive dysphagia. So, the structural causes include Shedsky ring and esophageal valve, which will lead to intermittent solid dysphagia. If there is progression of dysphagia, we should rule out a neoplasm, esophageal neoplasm, and variable obstruction is seen with peptic strictures, eosinophilic esophagitis, etc. If the patient is complaining of solid dysphagia along with odynophagia, dysphagia and adynophagia can be seen together. So, if along with difficulty in swallowing, patient is also complaining of severe pain while swallowing, we should consider the diagnosis of pill-induced esophagitis or any infections, caustic injury, or there can be mucositis secondary to chemotherapy. Now, propulsive dysphagia in esophagus can be due to GERD with weak peristalsis, achalasia cardia, diffuse esophageal spasm, and scleroderma. So, this is an important flowchart. Everyone should understand it carefully. Now, in the approach, now let's come on to the history taking. What all points can be asked to the patient and what are the objectives? So, history taking is extremely valuable in making the presumptive diagnosis and ruling out the differential diagnosis. So, the objectives of this history taking are to localize the dysphagia, to identify the circumstances in which dysphagia is experienced, what are the associated symptoms, and what is the progression. So, there are certain features in the history taking itself which can give us the clue towards the diagnosis. Firstly, if the patient is localizing the dysphagia to suprasternal notch, it can be seen in oropharyngeal dysphagia or esophageal dysphagia as well. So, it is important to note that dysphagia arising from distal esophagus is referred to cervical esophagus in 30% of the cases. Now, if the patient is localizing the dysphagia to chest, it is definitely a esophageal dysphagia. If there is associated nasal regurgitation or tracheobronchial aspiration, the patient usually complains of coughing while swallowing. This points towards the oropharyngeal dysphagia. If there is severe coughing just after swallowing, there is a possibility of tracheoesophageal fistula. In this, the food will enter the trachea and there will be coughing just after the swallowing. What is the association of hoarseness? If hoarseness is preceding the dysphagia, there can be a possibility of laryngeal mass. If hoarseness is occurring after the dysphagia, there can be a esophageal or food tract malignancy, which is later leading to recurrent laryngeal nerve palsy, leading to hoarseness of voice. If there is intermittent dysphagia, as we have discussed, only for solids, it is usually a structural cause in the esophagus. If it is a constant dysphagia both for liquids and solids in the esophagus, there is usually a motor abnormality underlying the esophageal dysphagia. If the dysphagia is progressive over weeks to months, we should always rule out a neoplasm. If there is food impaction which is not passing even with intake of liquids, it is a structural cause. If there is prolonged history of heartburns preceding the dysphagia, there can be formation of peptic stricture, and there can be rarely a possibility of esophageal adenocarcinoma. If there is accompanying odynophagia, as we discussed in the flowchart, it is usually due to ulceration, infections, or pill-induced esophagitis. Finally, AIDS or other immunocompromised states can lead to dysphagia due to esophageal or oropharyngeal candidiasis, herpes simplex virus infection, cytomegalovirus, Kaposi sarcoma, or lymphoma. So these all can lead to dysphagia in such patients. If there is strong history of atopy, rarely we should rule out eosinophilic esophagitis. So this is a very important slide of this lecture, in which on the basis of only history taking, you can identify the cause of dysphagia. Now after the history, coming on to the physical examination. Now it is important because dysphagia is usually only one of the many manifestations of a more global disease process. So we have to find out whether there are signs of bulbar or pseudobulbar palsy. Is there any generalized neuromuscular disease? Whether there is thyromegaly on palpation which can lead to compression leading to dysphagia. We should be inspecting the mouth or pharynx. Also, we should identify whether there is any missing dentition. So this missing dentition can interfere with mastication, which can also exacerbate existing cause of dysphagia. We should examine the skin for any changes which can be seen along with scleroderma, pemphigoid vulgaris, lichen planus, and epidermolysis bullosa. Now all of these conditions can involve the esophagus. Now coming on to certain diagnostic procedures which are required for the evaluation of dysphagia. Firstly, for the evaluation of oropharyngeal dysphagia, if we are suspecting a propulsive or motor cause, we should always consider fluoroscopic swallow study and a neurologist opinion. Now when we consider the fluoroscopic study, since the pharyngeal phase of swallowing occurs less than a second, we need rapid sequence fluoroscopy. So with the help of fluoroscopy, we examine the bolus retention, whether it is regurgitating into the nose, and the amount of aspiration in the trachea. Now these features, along with the timing of pharyngeal contraction and opening of upper esophageal sphincter, helps us in diagnosing the functional abnormalities or propulsive causes of oropharyngeal dysphagia. Also, we discussed that for functional or propulsive causes, we can have a neurologist opinion. Similarly, ENT opinion with direct laryngoscopy will help us in identify any structural cause of oropharyngeal dysphagia. Then upper GI endoscopy will help us in diagnosis of esophageal dysphagia. Now upper GI endoscopy is a single most useful test for suspected esophageal dysphagia. Now why it is considered better than barium radiography? Firstly, we have better visualization of the mucosal lesions. We can take the biopsies. Also, the leading causes of dysphagia are due to endoscopic or histological abnormalities like GERD, Schatzki ring, eosinophilic esophagitis. So these will be diagnosed by endoscopy, not by the barium studies. Finally, we have an advantage that we can perform therapeutic esophageal dilatation with the endoscopic procedure itself. Then we can do esophageal manometry if we are suspecting any propulsive esophageal disorder or esophageal motor disorder. Then barium radiography is required for any subtle or complex esophageal strictures, esophageal diverticular herniation or prior esophageal surgery. Also, CT scan and endoscopic ultrasonography can help us identify the specific causes. So this was all about this lecture, guys, and the treatment part is out of scope of this lecture. So the treatment is according to the condition, and this was all about the lecture. I hope you like this lecture. Thank you so much. Kindly hit the like and subscribe button.